Wordswise podcast is going to be a show about all topics. But to narrow this down a little bit further, we'll break it down into the realm of philosophy, or what it used to mean. In the Greek, it is the love of wisdom, the study of knowledge, reality, and existence. So this will cover grounds from the very beginning to current events to speculations about what might happen in the future. Do any of you gentlemen have any input on this?
Only that Pythagoras was the first to call himself the lover of wisdom. He was the first philosopher in that sense. What he called himself, philo, someone who was in love with wisdom. So, he was technically what we would consider the first Western philosopher.
I pretty much just want to say that I'm excited to be here right now. I've been friends with these guys since I was 12, so we've had a lot of conversations, and it seems like it would be a fun thing in order to share some of the things that we talk about, and hopefully you guys appreciate some of this too. That's the idea.
In the originally, philosophy covered all realms from history, like we said, current events, politics, even mathematics, architecture, art. Any throw-ins from that angle too? Metaphysics, epistemology. We'll break this down in further episodes, but
it was very syncretic. There was an idea of philosophy that was inclusive to all of the disciplines. There was no division between the two. In fact, most philosophers, including the ones we know the most, Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, were the ones who were trying to find unity among all of the disciplines. So, again, the love of wisdom is the idea of finding a syncretic method to be able to connect all of these things together.
a good intro point I wanted to bring in was the first philosopher, since this is our very first episode. So typically we had, anyone know the first philosopher?
Anyone what?
Any of you guys know the first philosopher?
The first philosopher?
Chad brought his opinion of the literal definition of the first philosopher.
I would probably guess Socrates.
Even though Pythagoras coined the term philosopher or philosophy, the first recognized philosopher, according to Aristotle, was Thales of Miletus, who is very likely to have been a teacher to Pythagoras. He's considered one of the seven sages of the Greeks, and we have the groundwork of what we consider the golden rule of society: do unto others as you would have do unto you. These ideas come from people like Thales of Miletus and the other six sages of Greece.
Yes, Chad is correct in that. You call him Thales, I guess I call him Thales. I'm not sure how that Egyptian language was spoken, but yes, in the early part of the 6th century BC, Thales is typically considered the first. He was from Ionia. Miletus specifically was the city, but Ionia was the region of that Grecian part of what is now Turkey.
Yep.
And the interesting thing about those first philosophers is they were considered abstract materialists. So they had the metaphysical idea that Earth was typically created from an element, and his was water. Like all things are created from water, and part of his reckoning of that was that water could mist or solidify depending on heat. So all matter, this is before telescopes of the atom and whatnot, but all matter could go back to that source of water. Philosophers that followed him, such as Anaximenes, believed it was air, and Heraclitus believed it was fire, because all things change.
Well, I guess it depends on what your what the goal is of what element you're talking about. I mean, when you say water, the first thing I think of is the current scientific outlook is liquid water is needed for life. So you could probably relate water to life, and maybe fire would be something that's not necessary. I mean, it's interesting because that would also be organic. Fire does a number on organic compounds by disintegrating them. So
Right, most scientific tests are done with fire. So you could, argue that everything starts with water but has to be tested with fire, heat, and the exchange of heat to be able to define the rudimentary aspects of a thing has to be done usually with heat.
it's interesting. It makes me think of Ayurvedics because the elements all have a purpose to what they're doing. So water, as in creating and designing life, and then fire changes that. That's kind of the element of what fire is known for.
Right.
Wind moves it around, and earth solidifies things
Right. It's
back into
magnet
form.
itself,
So
And that many cultures and the Greeks at that time period believed in those. That was before the periodic table of elements. These four elements were the key. And if I was to be in that time frame, I would probably say all four of them would have been combined to create. And you could argue that within ourselves right now, like fire is kind of our living soul.
why is our body warm?
Yeah,
You know.
and yet we need breath and wind to live. Obviously, beyond a matter of minutes, we need that solidity of earth to keep our individual form.
Right.
And of course, like was already mentioned, water's 70% of our makeup. So yeah, I just found that interesting that the original philosophers of the Grecian age were what they did term abstract materialists, because the reason it's abstract too is it wasn't they're kind of pontificating on the essential, almost ethereal nature of what these elements were, rather than saying we are just fire or everything is just
What is fire
literal fire.
What does fire
but
symbolize?
yeah,
in
more of
every
an
single
abstract
level
symbolization of it. Yeah.
Okay, that's interesting. That's why it's abstract. Okay.
Well, also, they were focused on the idea of opposites, the duality of things. So you needed, obvious is water, fire, right? So to them, breaking things down into rudimentary form, their root, this was all over Greek philosophy, is trying to take the abstract and break it down into the division of how does something come from nothing, or what is that rudimentary form that is created. And so to them, the natural elements were the basis to say this is all things can be broken down into these ideas. It wasn't until later, until people like Pythagoras and others who traveled into the Middle East and as far as India and into Egypt, that we understood greater, concepts of what that means, as far as the division of things. I think Greek philosophy started at a very rudimentary level. I think they were really trying to focus on the basics, which as far as a place to start, I think that's pretty wise, But as they started to branch out and find out what other people like the Chaldeans and the Babylonians and the Magi and the Brahmins and the Egyptians and so forth, these people all had, their own concepts, not only for the same ideas, but also in some ways were much more developed than what the Greeks had come up with at the time. And then, of course, these teachers brought that back to Greece and created what we know of as the beginnings of Western culture and society. So.
That's a good segue into my next topic. Well, not the next topic, but my theory of almost breaking away from this scholastic idea of Thales being the first philosopher is I would argue actually that every religion started from a philosophy, and that every human being themselves is a philosopher. We all carry our own philosophy of life, or how to interact with people, whatnot, our own idea of politics.
Yeah.
So this must have happened way before Thales.
Absolutely, yeah.
Right.
I mean, he may have been one of the first to have it as an actual job, but you could also argue that people like the Buddha, who was around at a very similar time frame as Thales, may have been one of the first philosophers. Zoroaster, who is arguably the first monotheist, who brought magism, as Chad mentioned, into it, may have been the first philosopher. Lao Tzu, who may be older than Thales, who brought Taoism to China, or introduced it because he was Chinese himself. Could have been a philosopher, but caveman, even the Neanderthals, it might predate humanity itself, or Homo sapiens as we are now.
Well, you think about philosophy as, why am I here? I'm sure even the first person to recognize their own consciousness started doing that.
Mm-hmm.
But then philosophy as what you described, the love of knowledge or wisdom, then I guess to some degree a philosopher has to be somebody that's actually sharing this with other people. Because we're all philosophers, and the first sentient human being was a philosopher. But then you have to actually say, who's the person that brought up the idea and started getting us to all talk about it?
Yeah.
I agree in that sense, because as far as like the philosopher as a whole, like what we would consider someone who is using these ideas as an ecumenical unity, some concept to be able to bring to other people. There's lots of teachers like that. I mean, we can't say that Greece was the only sole construct that created these kinds of ideas, because most of them come from other places as well. What we can say is the Greeks were responsible for uniting a lot of these ideas for the West, and that they brought this knowledge into a place that it could be cultivated, and that's why we have so many philosophers. And that's where the idea comes from of philosophy in itself, is that it's the idea that leisure, because we no longer have to toil in the fields, we now can have leisure to think and to create, so that these people who are incredibly smart, obviously, and gifted in these kinds of things, and well educated, can think about this stuff and create these kinds of concepts, and then they present them to the people. And ultimately, it was people like Socrates, who was one of the first major philosophers that we know of, who believed that that was what philosophy should be about, is being able to unify these concepts into such a way that they would be benefiting to people, not just some sort of idea of itself. It was
Not just a personalized thing, but actually a societal norm.
Right.
On some
It
level.
wasn't about creating elitism or differentiation. It was about these ideas are important because they're important to everyone. And that was what Socrates really believed in. And that's why he actually threw out most of what Pythagoras and other teachers before him had taught, because he did not see the application to other people. He wanted to create a system of ideas and concepts that would be beneficial to his own society. And he had a lot of problems too. There's the Sophists and the Philosophers. Well, the Sophists were these sort of elitist teachers who we would consider, basically, like professors today.
Almost lawyers
In a sense,
like
yeah,
that.
yeah. And the Sophists and the Philosophers, there's this huge divide between them. And I think that's another reason why Pythagoras coined that term, was to define himself against the Sophists, is the idea that this elite system where only the wealthy get educated. He was wealthy, his family was wealthy, so he learned how to read and write, he was able to know arithmetic and so forth. He knew about architecture and so forth. Because of that, because of his position, it allowed him that station in life. But he also saw how corrupt it was, and he was under a tyrant at the time as well, Samos. And the Sophists themselves were very much obliged to teach the rich because it was a beneficial, it was a symbiotic sort of relationship. They could all be in the sort of elite class. Socrates and others like him wanted to bring that down to the people. So
Seems like the logical thing to do.
yeah. Otherwise, like, even Pythagoras' own teachings, they died because he even kind of fell prey to that. Even though he fought against it, he kind of fell prey to it because he created his own niche of elitism. And his teachings mostly died. There's not a single shred of his own written teaching in his hand that survives. Most of what we know of Pythagoras is from people who came after him.
But you see, I like that because that's the same thing that Socrates really was too. Is he didn't write; he just spoke to people. And so when we have when we have the
Jesus,
works,
Buddha.
yeah, exactly. Like these are the people that they didn't care about sharing this with future generations or anything like that because they knew that if they were the conduit of this information, it would go out there into the world, and if it was true, it would stay.
Not only that, but I think there's something very esoteric about that too, is that the word spoken is alive, whereas writing it down, they're dead. They can be changed.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas the vocal word can't be. It has to be heard. You have to be present to hear it. It's alive. It's resonating. Whereas if you're writing it down over time, that can be changed. Look at the Bible.
Right.
I think that's a good example of something that's been
The same, on a little bit of a contrary note, though, it is kind of set in stone once you write it too, and it can
That's
be
what I'm
further
saying.
passed down into further extrapolate on what you're saying.
right.
This it's a trend that you find in other fields besides just what is typically called philosophy. Like writing was held for the elites at time, and people want to bring it down. Wealth in general
But why
was
did-
held by the elites, and it's a societal trend to want to bring it down to everybody from someone's point of view. Eventually, it comes down.
Usually
you know?
only through commerce, though. That the only reasons why the hierarchies, below them, the elite, had any sort of form of writing was usually through trade. That was it. It made sense because you needed traders and merchants to do commerce. You needed accurate records because this guy's money had to have been accurately reported, otherwise that guy's going to lose his head. So it did trickle down. There was a trickle down effect, and over time, he was even up to the medieval.
I would even
times.
say pulled down.
In a sense, yeah. There were people who definitely tried. Yeah.
Like you said, Socrates, or whatever, pulled it down. He didn't wait for it to be trickled
But
down.
look what they did to
Or
him.
Jesus.
Yeah.
They had a very similar
Yeah. Look what they did to Socrates.
life paths in a way.
Yeah. And all the great teachers, like you said, who didn't write anything down, look what happened to them. Most of these people were killed, for their belief systems. And, it seems like that seems an awful common trend among really great philosophers, which I would consider, Christ is one of those as well. He's a long line of, people who, there's many of the philosophers who you could actually put into that same bracket as far as Jesus is concerned. If you're not a religious person, you have to at least consider the concepts, of what was created out of that religion, as being philosophical. So.
I think about the semantics of living and dead, so a document is living when it can be changed. That's kind of what, people would call it today. And when you're using voice back then, it was living in the sense of it was organic and it was something that there was inflections. And so listening to it is more full because you're understanding more of the intonation of what's going on by the speaker. When you're just seeing it written down, it's a little bit more stagnant. But that can actually, it's just interesting because somebody says something, somebody else writes it down. Who knows what kind of truth was lost in that translation?
My point exactly. Yeah,
Right.
I think that's really the important aspect of writing. Is definitely important. That's what's created, the foundation, one of the major foundation stones of, civilization and society. But at the same time, like you said, what is lost in translation. So I think there was a definite stigma, and even if you go back to mythical characters like Hermes or Thoth or Toth or however you want to pronounce it, these people did not believe in actually, even though they taught writing, they didn't actually believe in writing anything down of themselves because they believed that knowledge, in the purity of that sense, especially the mystery schools, should be a verbal communication. The Druids and so forth. These were people who were very much in that idea that knowledge has to be passed down vocally from person to person. And there's like a chain there as well, where that connection of that person to that person, it's like the Jedi, concept, where you always have the master and the Padawan kind of an idea. That's really important, and most societies had that, where you had the master and the student, the adept, to where you had to pass down this information in a verbal sense. It wasn't written down as, hey, go, study this stuff and then do a test on it and then I'll let you know how well you did. It was verbal. It was a direct, in the moment idea of teaching.
Right. Because even if you couldn't read, you could still at least, obviously listen and understand.
It's a good point. It's a little more universal, and that artisanal idea of lineage might be something that's kind of fading to the detriment of our culture these days. I think you can say, people. It might even be why some of our universities and school systems may be a factor of why they are falling apart, when it might be better just to get into a trade, unfortunate to say as that is.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that we're mass producing knowledge.
And to go back onto point of First Philosophers, I want to get into a group that is not only in the realm of philosophy, but a group of people that have been left out in a lot of realms, the first female philosophers. When me and Chad were going to college, it was typically stated that Mary Wollstonecraft, and she was in the late 1700s, around the time when our declaration in this country was founded, the U.S. we're speaking of. She wrote a book, The Vindication of the Rights of Women, and again, sometimes I have a little vagueness on why they would call her the first philosopher. Maybe she was the first to make her living off of it, or whatnot.
She wrote a book, and she became well known for that.
And she, and I'm giving this back to you, Chad. Thank you for it.
Oh yeah.
What's that?
That is her book.
Show the people.
Yes. But, so during this time when our Constitution was created and the rights that the great experiment of the United States came about, way ahead of her time, because she's bringing that to the realm of women, which didn't come around to the 19th Amendment in 1920, 130 years after the book was written.
Yeah.
So
she laid all the groundwork for all of it. If it wasn't for her, then none of what came after would have happened, I think, in the time frame. It did take that long. She was one of the main foundation stones that really allowed women to be able to own property, and, have hereditary rights and so forth. Without her, it would not have been, as far as the Western world is concerned.
Another cool fact about her is she was the mother of Mary Wollstonecraft Shelley, who wrote Frankenstein.
No kidding. Wow.
Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah, very interesting.
But again, this was back over 10 years ago when me and Chad were in college. She was considered the first, but me doing the first, when I typed in the subject of first female on Google, it's now changed to Hypatia. Which I was glad to see. She's from Alexandria in the 300s AD.
Wow.
Do you want to go into a little of what she's all about?
An incredibly brilliant human being. But yeah, I would say Hypatia, in my opinion, as far as the Western world is concerned, as far as we know, of written record, she's the first. of the female philosophers.
And I was glad to see that the searches kind of brought that more into light. Like, yes, Mary Wollstonecraft was not even on the first page of searches. It was all Hypatia.
Yeah.
So
Yeah,
she was.
been plays written about her. I mean, she was very respected in her own time. There were many philosophers that spoke of her and how brilliant she was after she died. It was incredible. It was a huge tragedy for the Western world, and the Alexandria in particular, which is always a house of knowledge.
She was the last of the Neoplatonics.
She was.
So
Yeah, she was the Neoplatonic.
some of her orbital mathematics devised the ideas, one of the original ideas that the Earth was round too. So she spread some of that knowledge as well. So she was a great mathematician, astronomer. We, like Chad said, not any of her necessarily philosophy was philosophy of what's commonly termed philosophy was stated, but she taught at a philosophical school that she inherited down from her father. So, yeah, just to give some up to the ladies there. The astrolabe, that's actually what she created. Yeah.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
Oh, wow.
So, now on to the topic of...
This is a good time to take a break, you think?
I think so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
All right.
We're going to take a quick break, guys, and we'll be right back with you.